Blood dripped onto Italian marble as Minjun pressed his back against the restaurant's mahogany paneling. The bullet had torn through his shoulder, but that pain meant nothing compared to the certainty that death waited just beyond the dining room doors. 3 men with guns and no mercy had followed him into Aurelio's, the kind of upscale establishment where power brokers made deals over wine that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He had maybe 30 seconds before they found him. The private dining room offered no real sanctuary, just expensive furniture that would provide poor cover when the shooting started. Minjun's breathing came controlled and steady despite the circumstances. 28 years old and already the head of the Biko syndicate, he had survived too much to panic now. But survival required options, and he was rapidly running out of them. The door handle turned. That's when she appeared, moving with the purposeful grace of someone who belonged in this world of starched linens and crystal stemware. A black woman in her mid-20s, wearing the restaurant's signature black uniform that somehow managed to look elegant rather than servile on her tall frame. Her natural hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her dark eyes held the kind of steady intelligence that missed nothing. I'm watching from Atlanta tonight, and I can already feel the tension building in this upscale restaurant. Where are you watching from? And what do you think you would do in a situation like this? She took in the scene with remarkable calm. The blood on his shirt, the way he held his injured shoulder, the desperation he was trying so hard to hide. Most people would have screamed or run. She stepped fully into the room and quietly closed the door behind her. Please, he said, his accented English tight with pain and something that might have been humility. The word felt foreign on his tongue. Minjun Kong did not beg. He commanded, he negotiated, he eliminated problems with surgical precision. But bleeding in a restaurant while armed men hunted him, he found himself capable of things he had never imagined. Please save me. The woman studied him for exactly 3 heartbeats. Her gaze moved from his face to his wound, to the door where heavy footsteps approached. She was calculating odds, weighing risks, making a decision that could cost her everything. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice low and surprisingly steady. "Minjun," he whispered. "Well, Minjun," she said, stepping forward with the kind of confidence that suggested she was used to handling crises. "You're about to find out what happens when you put your life in the hands of a woman who's seen enough emergency room rotations to know a non-fatal wound when she sees one." She moved with startling efficiency, guiding him behind the heavy oak serving cabinet that dominated one corner of the room. The space was cramped, forcing them into intimate proximity that under any other circumstances would have been inappropriate. He caught the scent of her perfume, something light and clean that somehow cut through the metallic smell of his own blood. "Stay quiet and try not to bleed on the carpet," she murmured. "It's Persian and probably worth more than my car." The door burst open just as she positioned herself at the serving station, calmly arranging clean glasses with the practiced movements of someone who had done this thousands of times. 3 men entered, their faces hard with the kind of casual violence that Minjun recognized immediately. They were professionals, probably Korean, based on their movement patterns and the tactical precision of their formation. The woman looked up with mild interest, as if armed men bursting into private dining rooms was a common occurrence in her workday. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" she asked in the tone reserved for customers who were slightly disrupting the restaurant's peaceful atmosphere. "We're looking for someone," the lead man said in Korean, then switched to heavily accented English when she looked at him blankly. "A man. Injured. You see him." She shook her head with the kind of polite regret that suggested she genuinely wished she could be more helpful. "I'm sorry, but I haven't seen anyone matching that description. I've been preparing this room for a private party arriving in 20 minutes. Perhaps you could check with the hostess at the front." The man's eyes narrowed. He was clearly debating whether to believe her or tear the room apart looking for his quarry. Behind the cabinet, Minjun held his breath and tried to make himself as small as possible, which was challenging given his 6-foot frame. "You are certain?" the man pressed. "Absolutely," she replied with the kind of cheerful certainty that somehow made it impossible to doubt her. "Though if someone injured did come through here, I would definitely recommend they seek medical attention." Head injuries especially can be quite serious if left untreated. It was a masterful performance, Minjun realized. She was giving them just enough information to seem helpful while revealing absolutely nothing useful. The lead gunman studied her face for several long moments, clearly trying to determine if she was lying. Finally, he jerked his head toward the door. His team followed him out, their heavy footsteps retreating down the hallway. The woman waited until the sound completely faded before moving back to the cabinet. She crouched down beside him, her earlier calm giving way to focused concern as she examined his wound with gentle but confident hands. "You're lucky," she said quietly. "It went clean through the muscle. Painful, but not life-threatening if we get it treated properly. I'm Zara, by the way. Zara Williams." Minjun found himself staring at her profile as she worked. There was something about the way she held herself, the competence in her movements, the fearlessness she had just displayed that fascinated him. Women in his world were either completely removed from violence or hardened by it. Zara seemed to exist in some third category he had never encountered. "You saved my life," he said, the words carrying weight that went beyond simple gratitude. She glanced up at him, and for the first time since entering the room, her professional mask slipped slightly. Something passed between them in that moment, and recognition that neither fully understood but both felt in their bones. She had seen past his reputation and power to the vulnerable man underneath. He had seen past her uniform and working-class background to the extraordinary strength within. "Don't mention it," she said, but her voice had softened in a way that suggested this was no longer just about helping a stranger. "Though next time you decide to get shot, maybe choose a hospital instead of a five-star restaurant. The decor is much more blood-friendly." 3 hours later, Zara sat across from Minjun in the back of a black sedan that probably cost more than she would make in 5 years. The restaurant's first aid kit had provided temporary care for his wound, but he needed proper medical attention. What he had received instead was a phone call that changed everything. "The men who hunted you tonight work for the Chongryong Syndicate," Minjun said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "They will not give up, and now that you have helped me, they will consider you a threat to be eliminated." Zara studied his profile as city lights streaked past the window. In the restaurant, adrenaline had carried her through the crisis. Now, in the artificial calm of expensive leather seats and bulletproof glass, the full implications began to settle. She had saved a stranger's life and somehow painted a target on her own back. "Who exactly are you?" she asked, though something in the careful way his driver navigated traffic and the deference of the man who had appeared to escort them suggested she already knew the answer would complicate her life significantly. Minjun turned to face her fully, and she saw something shift in his expression. The vulnerability from the restaurant had been carefully locked away, replaced by the controlled authority of a man accustomed to command. "My name is Minjun Kong. I am the head of the Biko Syndicate, what Americans would call the Korean Mafia, though that term oversimplifies the complexity of what we actually do." Zara felt her stomach drop. She had saved the life of a crime boss, the kind of man her mother had warned her about in stories designed to keep her focused on school and away from dangerous situations. Yet looking at him now, she struggled to reconcile those warnings with the reality of the person beside her. There was no denying his power, but there was also an honor in the way he held himself that felt genuine. "The Chongryong Syndicate has been trying to move into our territory for months," Minjun continued. "Tonight was their most direct attempt yet to eliminate me. They failed, but they will try again. And because you helped me, they will assume you are important to me. That assumption, regardless of its accuracy, makes you a target." The sedan pulled through gates that whispered open at their approach, revealing a compound that looked like something from an architectural magazine. Clean lines and modern materials created an aesthetic that was both beautiful and unmistakably fortified. Discreet security cameras tracked their movement, while men in expensive suits moved with the casual alertness of professional bodyguards. "This is your world," Zara said, taking in the controlled luxury surrounding them. "Part of it," Minjun replied. "The part where I keep the people I am responsible for safe." They entered through a private entrance that led directly to what appeared to be a medical facility. A doctor was waiting, clearly summoned by the same phone call that had arranged their transportation. As the man began examining Minjun's shoulder, Zara found herself automatically assisting, her nursing school training taking over despite the surreal circumstances. "You have medical experience," the doctor noted in accented English, watching her competent handling of supplies. "Nursing student," Zara replied, focusing on the familiar routine of wound care rather than the implications of treating a crime boss in his fortified compound. 2 years completed, 1 to go. Minjun watched her work with an intensity that made her acutely aware of his presence. There was something about the way he observed everything, as if he was constantly evaluating and categorizing information. When she caught him staring, he did not look away. "You have options," he said once the doctor had finished and left them alone in what appeared to be a sitting room decorated with understated elegance. "You can return to your life and hope the Chongryong decide you are not worth their attention. Or you can accept my protection while we eliminate the threat they represent. It's not really a choice if one option gets me killed," Zara pointed out. Minjun's mouth curved in what might have been appreciation for her directness. "True. So let me make you a different offer. I need someone I can trust to manage certain aspects of my business that require discretion and intelligence. Personal assistant is the official title, though the reality involves considerably more responsibility. The position comes with security, housing, and compensation that would allow you to complete your nursing degree without working double shifts at restaurants." Zara recognized the offer for what it really was. Protective custody dressed up as employment. But the way he presented it, with respect for her intelligence rather than patronizing concern for her safety, made all the difference in how she received it. "What kind of responsibilities?" she asked. "Managing my schedule, attending meetings where I need someone who can read people and situations accurately, overseeing certain charitable operations that require medical knowledge. You would essentially become my right hand in matters requiring both intelligence and discretion." The offer was generous enough to seem too good to be true, which meant there were aspects he was not mentioning. Zara had grown up in neighborhoods where survival meant reading between lines and recognizing when powerful men were being less than completely honest. But she had also learned to recognize genuine respect when she saw it. "And if I refuse," she asked, "then I arrange for you to disappear safely until this conflict resolves itself," Minjun said. "New identity, relocation, whatever you need to stay alive. You saved my life. I do not repay such debts by allowing the person to be harmed because of their kindness." The sincerity in his voice convinced her more than any amount of money could have. This was not manipulation or coercion. It was a man with genuine power offering genuine protection to someone who had shown him genuine courage. Her phone buzzed with a text message, then another. Then her phone began ringing with a number she did not recognize. Minjun's expression darkened as he answered his own phone, speaking rapidly in Korean before ending the call with obvious frustration. "Your apartment building," he said grimly. 3 men matching the description of tonight's attackers were seen entering an hour ago. "My people are watching from a distance, but they report signs of a search in progress." The reality hit her like cold water. They were not just making threats or trying to send messages. They were actively hunting her, going through her personal possessions, violating the sanctuary of her home. The life she had built through years of careful planning and hard work was being torn apart by men she had never met because she had made one split-second decision to help someone in need. "Okay," she said, surprised by how steady her voice remained. "I accept your offer, but I have conditions." Minjun raised an eyebrow, clearly not accustomed to people making demands when accepting his protection. "Name them." "First, I continue my nursing studies. Whatever schedule we arrange has to accommodate my classes and clinical rotations. Second, I maintain contact with my family and friends. I won't disappear from their lives completely. Third, this arrangement has a defined endpoint. When the threat is eliminated, I get to choose whether to stay or return to my original life." He considered her terms with the same serious attention he might give a business contract. Finally, he nodded. "Agreed." though I would add one condition of my own. You follow security protocols without argument. The people trying to hurt you are professionals who will not hesitate to kill anyone they perceive as connected to me." "Agreed," Zara said, then extended her hand. "I suppose we have a deal, Mr. Kong." Minjun took her hand, and she felt the controlled strength in his grip, the calluses that suggested he was not simply a businessman who let others handle physical work. When he smiled, it transformed his entire face from intimidating authority to something approaching warmth. "Welcome to the Biko Syndicate, Miss Williams. Though I suspect you may find it quite different from whatever expectations you might have about organizations like ours." As if summoned by his words, a young man appeared in the doorway. Perhaps 16 years old, he moved with the careful deference of someone who had learned early that respect was the price of survival in this world. But when he looked at Minjun, there was genuine affection alongside the respect. "Hyung," the boy said, using the Korean term for older brother. "Mrs. Chun says dinner will be ready in 20 minutes. Should she set a place for the guest?" "Please," Minjun replied, his voice gentling in a way that revealed an entirely different side of his personality. "Zara, this is Jae-sung. Jae-sung, Miss Williams will be staying with us for a while." The boy bowed politely to Zara, then looked back at Minjun with obvious concern. "Your shoulder, Hyung. Are you badly hurt?" "Nothing that won't heal," Minjun assured him. "But thank you for worrying about your troublesome older brother." Watching their interaction, Zara realized she was seeing yet another layer of the man she had agreed to trust with her life. There was genuine care in the way he spoke to the boy, a protective tenderness that had nothing to do with business or territory or power. This was family, chosen if not blood-related, and the bond between them was real. As Jae-sung disappeared back down the hallway, Minjun turned back to Zara with an expression that seemed almost vulnerable. "You will find that the Biko Syndicate is not simply a criminal organization," he said. "We are a family that protects its own and serves our community in ways the law cannot or will not. I hope you will come to understand the difference." Looking around the compound, seeing the careful way his people moved and the genuine affection they showed their leader, Zara began to suspect that her assumptions about the criminal underworld were about to be thoroughly challenged. She had agreed to stay in order to survive, but she was beginning to realize that survival might be only the beginning of what this arrangement would teach her about power, loyalty, and the complex moral landscape of a world she had never imagined joining. 2 weeks into her new life, Zara discovered that living in Minjun's world meant redefining everything she thought she understood about family, loyalty, and the thin line between protection and control. The compound operated like a small city, complete with its own medical facility, security protocols, and unwritten rules that everyone except her seemed to understand instinctively. She was reviewing scheduling conflicts in what had become her office when commotion erupted in the main courtyard. Shouting in Korean, running footsteps, and underneath it all, the sound of someone in serious pain. Zara abandoned her paperwork and followed the noise, her nursing instincts overriding any concerns about protocol. What she found was chaos barely contained by Minjun's commanding presence. One of his men, a stocky enforcer named Dongwoo, was bleeding heavily from what appeared to be a deep knife wound across his ribs. The compound's doctor was in the city at a conference, and the nearest hospital would ask too many questions about how a known associate of the Biko Syndicate had acquired such injuries. "Move," Zara said, pushing through the circle of concerned men to kneel beside Dongwoo. Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to medical emergencies, and to her surprise, the hardened criminals stepped back without question. The wound was serious but not immediately life-threatening if treated properly. Zara's hands moved with practiced efficiency, applying pressure to control bleeding while mentally cataloging what supplies she would need. This was familiar territory, the kind of crisis management that had drawn her to nursing in the first place. "I need the medical kit from the facility downstairs," she said without looking up. "And someone boil water while I clean this properly. He's going to need stitches," but the cut missed anything vital. Minjun appeared beside her, his presence both calming and intensely distracting. "What do you need?" he asked, his usual formal tone replaced by something that sounded almost like concern. "Space to work and trust that I know what I'm doing," Zara replied, then immediately wondered if speaking so directly to the leader of a criminal organization was a career-limiting decision. Instead of taking offense, Minjun smiled with what looked suspiciously like admiration. "You heard her," he said to his men. "Give Miss Williams room to save Dongwu's stubborn hide." For the next hour, Zara worked with the focused intensity that had made her clinical instructors take notice. She cleaned and sutured the wound, monitored Dongwu for signs of shock, and administered pain medication with the careful precision of someone who understood that mistakes in dosage could be fatal. Throughout the procedure, Minjun remained nearby, not interfering but available for anything she might need. When Dongwu was finally stable and resting comfortably, Zara found herself alone with Minjun in the medical facility's recovery room. The space felt different with just the two of them, smaller somehow, charged with an awareness that had been building between them since that first night in the restaurant. "You saved his life," Minjun said, his voice carrying a weight that went beyond simple gratitude. "It's what I do," Zara replied, though she was acutely aware of how his presence seemed to fill the room. "Or what I'm training to do, anyway." She turned to find him watching her with an intensity that made her suddenly conscious of how close they were standing. There was something in his expression that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with the attraction that had been simmering between them since their first meeting. For a moment, she thought he might step closer, might finally acknowledge what was happening between them. Instead, he stepped back, his expression becoming carefully neutral. "Thank you," he said formally. "Dongwu has been with us since we were teenagers. Losing him would have been difficult." The moment passed, leaving Zara with the frustrating awareness that they were both pretending not to feel something that was becoming increasingly impossible to ignore. She gathered her supplies with more force than necessary, using the familiar routine to regain her equilibrium. That evening, she found Minjun in what she had learned was his private study, a room that somehow managed to blend traditional Korean aesthetics with modern functionality. He was reading to Jae-sung, who was curled up in an oversized chair like the teenager he still was despite the adult responsibilities he had been forced to assume. The book was in English, something about dragons and knights that seemed far removed from the dangerous world they all inhabited. Minjun's voice was gentle as he read, patient when Jae-sung interrupted with questions or comments. Watching them together, Zara felt something shift in her chest, a softening toward this man who could command absolute loyalty from hardened criminals and still take time to read bedtime stories to a boy who had no one else. When Jae-sung finally fell asleep, Minjun carefully lifted him and carried him to his room with the tenderness of an older brother. Zara waited in the study, surrounded by books in multiple languages and artwork that suggested depths to Minjun's character she was only beginning to discover. He returned 20 minutes later to find her examining a framed photograph on his desk. It showed a younger Minjun with what appeared to be his family, all formal traditional dress and serious expressions, except for a small girl who was grinning mischievously at the camera. "My sister," Minjun said, settling into the chair across from her. "She died when I was 22. Car accident. Though the circumstances were suspicious enough that we suspected the Chongryong syndicate was involved even then." Zara looked up from the photograph to find pain flickering across his features. "I'm sorry," she said, meaning it. "Losing family like that, it changes everything. It made me understand that power without the willingness to use it is meaningless," Minjun replied, "and that sometimes protecting the people you love requires making choices that others will never understand or forgive." The vulnerability in his admission surprised her. This was not the controlled crime boss who commanded through authority and fear. This was a man who had been shaped by loss and responsibility, who carried the weight of protecting his chosen family with the same seriousness most people reserve for their blood relatives. "Is that why you took in Jae-sung?" she asked. "Among others," Minjun said. "There are currently 12 children and teenagers under Biko protection. Some are orphans, some fled abusive situations, some simply had nowhere else to go. We provide education, safety, and opportunities they would not have otherwise. Zara found herself reassessing everything she thought she knew about organized crime. This was not the ruthless exploitation she had expected, but something closer to an extended family taking care of its most vulnerable members. The moral complexity made her uncomfortable in a way that simple, good versus evil narratives never had. "You're not what I expected," she admitted. Minjun's mouth curved in what might have been amusement. "What did you expect? Someone colder, more cruel, someone who saw people as assets instead of human beings. And what do you see now?" The question hung between them, laden with implications that went far beyond simple curiosity. Zara looked at him, sitting in his study, surrounded by books and family photographs, still wearing the expensive suit that marked his authority, but with his formal mask lowered enough for her to see the man underneath. "Someone who cares deeply but hides it well," she said finally. "Someone who learned early that showing weakness could get the people you love killed." Something shifted in Minjun's expression, a recognition that she had seen something true about him that he rarely revealed to anyone. The air between them seemed to thicken with possibility, with the acknowledgement of an attraction that was becoming difficult to deny. "Zara," he said, her name carrying a weight that made her acutely aware of how alone they were, how close she was sitting, how much she wanted to close the remaining distance between them. Her phone buzzed with an incoming call, shattering the moment with the harsh intrusion of outside responsibility. She glanced at the screen to see her mother's number and felt reality crash back around her. She was in the compound of a crime boss, having feelings for a man whose world operated by rules she didn't understand, while her family had no idea where she was or what had happened to her life. "I should take this," she said, already rising from her chair and stepping away from the dangerous intimacy of the moment. Minjun nodded, his expression carefully controlled once again. "Of course, family is important." But as she answered the call and moved toward the door, she caught him watching her with an intensity that suggested their interrupted moment was far from forgotten. The attraction between them was no longer something either could pretend didn't exist. The question was what they would do about it. Over the following days, Zara found herself drawn into the rhythms of Minjun's world in ways that went beyond her official duties as his assistant. She sat in on meetings where her ability to read people proved invaluable, attended cultural events where her presence helped humanize the Biko Syndicate's reputation, and gradually became someone the organization's members turned to for advice and support. More importantly, she began to understand the complex moral landscape Minjun navigated daily. The Biko Syndicate operated businesses that were entirely legitimate alongside others that existed in legal gray areas. They provided protection for small business owners who couldn't rely on police response, mediated disputes in communities where official channels moved too slowly, and maintained order in neighborhoods that might otherwise be controlled by less scrupulous organizations. It was during a community meeting in Koreatown that she first openly challenged his approach. The issue was a proposal to expand protection services to include several apartment buildings whose elderly residents were being harassed by a rival gang. Minjun's initial response was to establish a permanent security presence, which would have been effective but also expensive and potentially escalating. "That's treating the symptom, not the disease," Zara said, speaking up from her position at the back of the room. "You neutralize the immediate threat, but you don't address why these people are vulnerable in the first place." The room went silent. Challenging the boss in front of his lieutenants was apparently not standard protocol. Minjun's expression remained neutral, but she caught the flicker of interest in his eyes. "What would you suggest, Miss Williams?" he asked with formal politeness that didn't quite hide his curiosity. "Community engagement," Zara replied, moving forward to stand beside him rather than remaining safely in the background. Half these elderly residents are isolated because their children moved away and their neighbors are too afraid to get involved. If we organize regular social events, establish a buddy system, and create legitimate reasons for people to check on each other, the building becomes a community instead of a collection of vulnerable individuals. The suggestion sparked a debate that lasted 2 hours and resulted in a comprehensive plan that combined Minjun's security resources with Zara's community-building approach. More importantly, it established her as someone whose opinions carried weight within the organization, someone who could offer perspectives that complemented rather than simply supported Minjun's leadership. Walking back to the compound that evening, Zara realized she was no longer simply surviving in Minjun's world. She was becoming part of it, contributing to it, finding ways to make it better while it simultaneously changed her understanding of power, loyalty, and the complex moral choices that defined adult life. "You were right about the community approach," Minjun said as they reached the compound gates. "I was thinking like a general when the situation required a social worker." "You were thinking like someone who learned that strength is the only reliable protection," Zara replied. "But sometimes the strongest thing you can do is help people protect themselves." They paused in the courtyard, the space between them charged with everything they had been carefully not saying for weeks. The attraction had evolved into something deeper, a recognition of compatibility that went beyond physical attraction to encompass shared values and complementary strengths. Minjun reached out as if to touch her face, then stopped himself just short of contact. "Zara," he said, her name carrying a weight of longing and frustration. This time, she was the one who stepped back, though it cost her more than she wanted to admit. "We can't," she said quietly. "Not while I'm here under these circumstances. Not while my staying depends on your protection." Understanding flickered across his features, followed by something that looked like respect. "You're right," he said, "but that doesn't make this easier." "No," Zara agreed, already missing the warmth of his almost touch. "It doesn't." But as she walked toward her quarters, she could feel him watching her, and she knew that the careful boundaries they had just reinforced were becoming harder to maintain with each passing day. The recognition between them was complete now. They had seen past each other's surface roles to the people underneath, and what they had found was a compatibility that promised either the fulfillment of their deepest desires or the complete destruction of the careful balance they had built. The charity gala was supposed to be a routine appearance, the kind of community event where Minjun's presence served multiple purposes. Show respect for Korean-American business leaders, demonstrate the Biko Syndicate's commitment to legitimate community involvement, and provide Zara with experience navigating the social dynamics of his world. The hotel ballroom glittered with expensive gowns and political networking, exactly the sort of civilized environment where violence seemed impossible. Zara should have recognized the setup earlier. She had learned enough about Minjun's security protocols to know that his men were positioned too far apart, that the exits were inadequately covered, that something fundamental was wrong with the evening's arrangements. But she was distracted by the way Minjun looked in his formal tuxedo, by the careful attention he paid to her comfort as they navigated conversations with donors and community leaders, by the growing certainty that her feelings for him had evolved far beyond simple attraction. She was returning from the ladies' room when everything went wrong. The first indication of trouble was the sudden absence of background noise from the ballroom. Conversations didn't fade naturally. They stopped abruptly, as if someone had thrown a switch. Zara paused in the hallway, every instinct she had developed over the past month, screaming warnings she should have heeded immediately. The second indication was the man who stepped out of the service corridor, blocking her path back to the ballroom. She recognized him from security photos Minjun had shown her. Park Sang-wook, lieutenant in the Chongryong Syndicate, and the kind of professional who treated violence as a business tool rather than a last resort. "Miss Williams," he said with the polite tone of someone making a social introduction. "You will please come with me." Behind him, two more men appeared, their positioning making it clear that refusing his invitation was not actually an option. Zara's mind raced through possibilities, calculating odds and escape routes with the analytical clarity that crisis situations had always triggered in her. The ballroom was 50 feet away, but it might as well have been 50 miles if Park's men had already neutralized Minjun's security. "Where is Minjun?" she asked, proud that her voice remained steady despite the fear coursing through her system. "Busy with his own problems," Park replied. "But do not worry. You are the prize we actually came for tonight." The words hit her like cold water. This was not a coincidence or an opportunistic grab. This was a carefully planned operation designed to use her against Minjun, to prove that his protection was inadequate and that even those closest to him were vulnerable to Chongryong reach. "You made a mistake targeting me," Zara said, stalling for time while she evaluated her options. "I'm not some helpless victim you can use as leverage." Park's expression shifted to something that might have been amusement if it hadn't been so cold. "We shall see, Miss Williams. We shall see." What happened next unfolded with the terrible efficiency of professionals executing a well-rehearsed plan. A cloth pressed over her face, the sharp chemical smell of chloroform, and the world dissolving into darkness despite her attempts to hold her breath and fight back. Her last conscious thought was frustration that she had allowed herself to be taken so easily. She woke in what appeared to be a warehouse, her hands zip-tied behind her back and her head pounding from whatever they had used to keep her unconscious during transport. The space was large and echoing, filled with shipping containers and industrial equipment that created too many shadows and hiding places for her to accurately assess her situation. But she was not alone. For other people sat against the far wall, also restrained, looking like civilian casualties who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. An elderly Korean man in an expensive suit, a young woman still wearing an evening gown, and two hotel staff members whose uniforms suggested they had been grabbed during the initial assault on the gala. All of them showed signs of rough treatment, and the elderly man appeared to be having difficulty breathing. The young woman looked up as Zara stirred. "Are you hurt?" she whispered in accented English. "Just a headache," Zara replied, immediately shifting into assessment mode. "What about him?" She nodded toward the elderly man. "His heart," the woman said with obvious concern. "He needs his medication, but they would not let us bring anything." Zara's nursing training kicked in, overriding fear with the familiar rhythm of patient care. Even restrained, she could still observe and evaluate. The man's breathing was labored, but not immediately critical. Stress-induced angina, possibly, but manageable if she could find a way to help him stay calm and regulate his breathing. "Sir," she said softly, moving as close as her restraints would allow. "I'm a nurse. I want you to focus on my voice and try to slow your breathing. In through your nose, hold for 3 counts, out through your mouth." The man's eyes focused on her with desperate gratitude, and she began the careful process of talking him through breathing exercises while simultaneously searching for anything in their environment that might be useful for escape or defense. That was when she heard the gunfire. The sound came from outside the warehouse, controlled bursts rather than random shooting, which suggested professional rather than panic response. Minjun had found them, and he was not coming alone. Park appeared from behind one of the shipping containers, no longer bothering with polite pretense. His expression was grim with the knowledge that his carefully planned operation was falling apart. Behind him came 4 armed men, moving with the kind of tactical precision that suggested military or police training. "Your boyfriend is more resourceful than we anticipated," Park said to Zara, "but it will not matter. By the time he reaches us, you will be dead, and he will understand the cost of challenging the Chongryong Syndicate." One of Park's men positioned himself near the civilians, his weapon trained on them with casual readiness. The message was clear. Any rescue attempt would result in a bloodbath that would leave everyone dead except possibly Zara, who they apparently wanted alive long enough to make Minjun watch her die. The gunfire outside was getting closer, more intense, punctuated by what sounded like explosions. Through high windows, she could see the flicker of flames and the sweep of searchlights. Whatever was happening out there, it was large-scale and violent, the kind of military-style operation that suggested Minjun had called in every resource at his disposal. But none of that would matter if she could not find a way to neutralize the immediate threat to the civilians. Park's men were positioned to kill everyone in the warehouse the moment they felt threatened by external forces. Zara began working at her restraints, using techniques she had learned in self-defense classes years earlier. The zip ties were tight, but not professionally applied, suggesting they'd been installed by someone who understood restraint but not escape prevention. If she could create enough slack, if she could time her movement with the chaos outside, if she could reach the first aid kit she had spotted near the loading dock. The elderly man's breathing was becoming more labored, his color turning ashen with the kind of distress that preceded cardiac events. Without intervention, he would be dead within minutes regardless of what happened with the rescue operation. "I need to help him," Zara called out to Park, using her most authoritative medical voice. "He's having a heart attack. If you want him alive to use as leverage, you need to let me treat him." Park considered this for a moment, clearly weighing the strategic value of keeping civilian hostages alive against the risk of allowing his primary prisoner more mobility. "You may approach him," he decided, "but slowly and with no sudden movements." Zara moved toward the elderly man with careful deliberation, her hands still restrained behind her back, but her mind racing through possibilities. The first aid kit was closer now, within reach if she could create the right distraction. More importantly, she could see that the young woman in the evening gown had been watching her work at her restraints and seemed to understand that an escape attempt was imminent. As she knelt beside the elderly man, Zara whispered instructions that had nothing to do with medical care. "When I move, get everyone behind the container on your left. Stay low, stay quiet, and if shooting starts, keep them calm." The woman nodded almost imperceptibly, her eyes showing the kind of courage that suggested she understood the stakes and was prepared to do whatever was necessary to survive. The explosion that rocked the warehouse came without warning, violent enough to knock two of Park's men off their feet and send debris raining down from the ceiling. Emergency lighting flickered on as the main power failed, casting everything in harsh red shadows that made it nearly impossible to track movement. In the chaos that followed, several things happened simultaneously. Zara lunged for the first aid kit, her partially loosened restraints finally giving way as adrenaline provided the extra strength she needed to break free. The young woman grabbed the elderly man and began moving the civilians toward cover, her evening gown tearing as she half-carried, half-dragged him to safety behind the shipping container. Park's men tried to re-establish control, but the darkness and debris made it impossible to track targets accurately. Their training told them to eliminate the hostages rather than risk them becoming assets for the rescue operation, but they could not see clearly enough to ensure clean kills. And through the loading dock doors, figures in tactical gear poured into the warehouse with the coordinated precision of a military assault team. Minjun was not among them. He was better than that, too valuable to risk in direct assault. But his presence was felt in every movement, every decision, every perfectly executed maneuver that demonstrated the resources and planning he had brought to bear on this operation. Zara reached the elderly man just as the first exchange of gunfire erupted across the warehouse. Using supplies from the first aid kit and techniques learned in trauma rotations, she began emergency cardiac support while bullets flew over their heads and Park's operation disintegrated into desperate chaos. The fight was over in less than 5 minutes. When the shooting stopped and the emergency lighting was replaced by powerful floods brought in by Minjun's security team, Zara found herself kneeling beside an elderly man whose breathing had stabilized, surrounded by civilians who had survived because of her quick thinking and courage, while Park and his men were either dead or restrained for what promised to be very unpleasant interrogation. Minjun appeared beside her so suddenly that she startled, despite knowing he was coming. His formal tuxedo was gone, replaced by tactical gear that made him look less like a businessman and more like the dangerous man he actually was. There was something in his eyes that she had never seen before, a cold fury that spoke to exactly what he was capable of when someone threatened what he valued. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his hands moving over her with gentle efficiency, checking for injuries while his voice carried none of the controlled calm she was accustomed to hearing. "I'm fine," Zara said, though her hands were shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. They were going to kill everyone. I couldn't let them kill everyone. Minjun's expression shifted as he processed what had happened, what she had done, the risk she had taken to protect people she did not even know. When he looked at her again, There was something approaching awe in his features. "You saved them," he said. "All of them. While restrained and under guard, you found a way to save them all." "It's what anyone would have done," Zara replied, though they both knew that was not true. "No," Minjun said with absolute certainty. "It is what you would have done. It is who you are." They were interrupted by one of his security team reporting that Park had been taken alive and was ready for interrogation. Minjun nodded, but did not immediately move to leave. Instead, he helped Zara to her feet and guided her away from the civilians who were being processed by medical personnel and police officers who asked no uncomfortable questions about jurisdiction or chain of custody. "This ends tonight," he said with quiet intensity. "Park will tell us everything about Chongryong operations, and by tomorrow morning, their leadership will no longer be in a position to threaten anyone under Biko protection." The certainty in his voice told her that Park's interrogation would be thorough and that the Chongryong syndicate would cease to exist as an operational threat. She should have been disturbed by the implications, by the knowledge that Minjun was about to orchestrate what amounted to a small war. Instead, she found herself grateful that someone with his resources and determination considered her worth protecting absolutely. In the car returning to the compound, surrounded by security vehicles and the quiet efficiency of an organization mobilized for total warfare, Zara finally allowed herself to process what had happened. She had been kidnapped, threatened, and used as bait in a conflict she had not chosen. She had risked her life to protect strangers and proven herself capable of functioning under pressure that would have broken most people. More importantly, she had seen Minjun's response when she was truly threatened, the resources he would deploy and the risks he would take to ensure her safety. This was not the careful protection of a valuable asset. This was the absolute devotion of a man who would burn down the world rather than lose the woman he loved. "You could have been killed tonight," Minjun said quietly, his voice tight with emotion he was not quite managing to suppress. "So could you," Zara replied. "So could everyone. But we weren't, and that matters more than what might have happened." They reached the compound to find it transformed into a fortress, with security measures that made the previous arrangements look casual by comparison. As they walked through hallways filled with armed personnel and tactical equipment, Zara realized that her presence had fundamentally changed the stakes of Minjun's existence. He was no longer simply protecting his organization and territory. He was protecting the woman who had become essential to his emotional survival. In the privacy of his study, away from the controlled chaos of an organization preparing for war, they finally allowed themselves to acknowledge what they had been carefully avoiding for weeks. "I thought I had lost you," Minjun said, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking. "When they took you, when I realized they were using you to get to me, I understood that everything I thought I knew about fear was insignificant compared to the possibility of losing you." Zara looked at this powerful man who commanded absolute loyalty from hardened criminals, who could mobilize resources that most people could not imagine, who was about to eliminate an entire criminal organization to ensure her safety, and saw him completely vulnerable for the first time since they had met. "I was terrified," she admitted, "not of dying, but of never seeing you again. Of never getting to tell you that somewhere in these past weeks, I stopped being afraid of your world and started being afraid of leaving it." Minjun moved toward her with careful deliberation, giving her every opportunity to step back or indicate that she was not ready for what was about to happen between them. Instead, she met him halfway, closing the distance that had defined their relationship since that first night in the restaurant. When he kissed her, it was with the desperate intensity of someone who had nearly lost everything that mattered. When she kissed him back, it was with the absolute certainty that she had found exactly where she belonged, regardless of how dangerous or complicated that place might be. The careful boundaries they had maintained were gone, burned away by crisis and replaced with the recognition that what they felt for each other was worth any risk, any complication, any challenge the world might present. They had seen each other tested under the worst possible circumstances and found exactly the partners they needed for whatever came next. 3 days after the warehouse, the last of the Chongryong syndicate ceased to exist as an organized threat. Park had provided extensive intelligence during his interrogation, intelligence that Min Jun's organization had used with surgical precision to dismantle a criminal network that had operated in the city for over a decade. What remained of their leadership was either dead, imprisoned, or had fled the country with the understanding that returning would be unwise. Zara sat in the compound's garden, surrounded by the carefully maintained beauty of flowering cherry trees and traditional stone arrangements, processing the reality that she was finally safe. No more looking over her shoulder, no more security escorts for basic errands, no more living in the shadow of violence that could arrive without warning. The threat that had defined her existence for the past month was gone, eliminated with the kind of thorough efficiency that reminded her exactly how powerful the man she loved actually was. Min Jun found her there as the afternoon light began to fade, carrying an envelope that she somehow knew would change everything between them once again. He moved with the careful deliberation of someone approaching a conversation that could determine the rest of his life, and Zara felt her heart rate increase as he settled beside her on the stone bench. "The Chandriyong threat is finished," he said without preamble. "Park confirmed that you were specifically targeted because of your importance to me, which means their elimination was the only way to ensure your permanent safety. You are free to return to your life without fear." The words should have brought relief, but instead Zara felt something that might have been panic. Freedom meant choice, and choice meant the possibility of losing what she had found in this dangerous, complicated world that had somehow become home. Min Jun handed her the envelope with the same formal courtesy he had shown when offering her employment 6 weeks earlier. "Your contract," he said simply. "I am formally dissolving our arrangement. You are no longer bound by any obligation to remain here or to work for the Biko Syndicate." Zara opened the envelope to find her original employment agreement, torn neatly in half and accompanied by a document that looked suspiciously like a settlement agreement. The figures listed were generous enough to fund her nursing degree, support her family, and provide financial independence for years to come. "This is more than we agreed on," she said, scanning the terms with growing disbelief. "It is what your service has been worth to me," Min Jun replied. "What your courage and intelligence have contributed to this organization. What your presence has meant to everyone here, but especially to me." There was something in his voice that made her look up from the papers to study his expression. He was nervous, she realized with surprise. This powerful man who commanded absolute loyalty from hardened criminals was nervous about a conversation with a woman who had been legally bound to his service until 5 minutes ago. "I have something else to offer you," he said, reaching into his jacket to produce a small velvet box that made Zara's breath catch in her throat. "But this offer comes with no contracts, no obligations, no security arrangements or employment terms. This offer is from the man who loves you to the woman he hopes loves him in return." Min Jun opened the box to reveal a ring that was both beautiful and unmistakably significant. The center stone was a perfect diamond, but it was surrounded by smaller gems in a traditional Korean setting that spoke to heritage and family legacy. This was not simply an engagement ring. This was a piece of history being offered as a symbol of permanent commitment. "Zara Williams," Min Jun said, her full name carrying the weight of absolute formality, "will you marry me? Not because circumstances have forced us together, not because I can protect you better than anyone else, not because our arrangement has evolved into something more convenient. Will you marry me because you choose to build a life with me, because you want to be my partner in everything, because what we have found together is worth more than any other possibility either of us might imagine?" Looking at him in the fading light, surrounded by the beauty of the garden he had created and the security he had built, Zara realized that her answer had been forming for weeks. Every conversation, every shared moment of vulnerability, every demonstration of his character and hers had been building toward this moment of absolute choice. "Yes," she said, surprised by how steady her voice remained despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "But I have conditions." Min Jun's mouth curved in the smile that had become precious to her over the past weeks. "Of course you do. Name them." "First," Zara said, extending her left hand so he could place the ring where it belonged, We are partners in everything. Your business, your decisions, your responsibilities. I'm not marrying a crime boss who will protect me from his world. I'm marrying a man who will trust me to be part of that world. Agreed, Minjun said, sliding the ring into place with reverent care. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her specifically. Second, she continued, my medical clinic becomes a priority. Not a charity project or a way to legitimize your operations, but a real healthcare facility that serves the community regardless of their ability to pay or their immigration status. Already planned, Minjun replied. I have purchased a building in Koreatown that will suit your specifications perfectly. Construction begins next month. Third, Zara said, leaning forward so their faces were inches apart, you never again put yourself at unnecessary risk to protect me. We protect each other, or we protect no one. Minjun considered this for a moment, clearly recognizing that she was asking him to trust her strength rather than simply sheltering her vulnerability. That will be the most difficult condition to honor, he admitted. But yes, we protect each other. Then yes, Zara said, closing the remaining distance between them to seal their engagement with a kiss that tasted like promises and possibility. Yes, I will marry you. Yes, I choose this life with you. Yes to all of it. The wedding planning that followed revealed just how completely their worlds had merged over the past weeks. Zara's family, initially skeptical of her mysterious new boyfriend, found themselves charmed by Minjun's formal courtesy and obvious devotion to their daughter. His organization, from the youngest members like Jae-sung to the most senior lieutenants, embraced her as their leader's chosen partner with the same loyalty they showed him. The ceremony itself was a masterpiece of cultural fusion, held in the compound's main hall that had been transformed into something that honored both Korean and African-American traditions. Traditional hanbok and silk that complemented Zara's skin tone, music that blended both heritages, food that represented the best of both cultures, and vows that were spoken in English and Korean with equal reverence. Jae-sung served as Minjun's best man, wearing traditional dress with the proud bearing of someone who understood that he was witnessing the creation of his new family structure. Zara's sister flew in from Chicago to serve as her maid of honor, initially intimidated by the obvious wealth and power surrounding the event, but gradually won over by the genuine warmth of the community that had embraced her sister. During this ceremony, as they exchanged rings and promises before their merged families, Zara found herself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. A desperate man bleeding in a restaurant, a split-second decision to offer help, weeks of forced proximity that had revealed compatibility neither had expected, and a crisis that had proven their love was worth any risk. But the most meaningful moment came during the reception, when Minjun stood to address their guests in both languages, formally introducing Zara not as his wife, but as his partner in leadership of the Biko Syndicate. The announcement was met with genuine enthusiasm from his organization and barely concealed surprise from her family, who were still adjusting to the reality that their daughter was now married to one of the most powerful men in the city's Korean-American community. Later, in the privacy of their shared quarters that had been completely redesigned to accommodate both their belongings and their merged life, Zara and Minjun finally had the conversation that would define how their marriage would actually function. Your people accepted me tonight, Zara said, settling in a bed beside the man who was now her husband in every legal and emotional sense. They have respected you for weeks, Minjun replied, pulling her close with the easy intimacy of someone who no longer needed to maintain careful distance. Tonight simply made official what has been true since you saved Dongwa's life. And my family accepted you, despite having no idea what to make of your world, Zara added with amusement. Your mother threatened to hurt me very badly if I ever make you unhappy, Minjun said with what sounded like admiration. I believe she meant it quite seriously. She did, Zara confirmed. My mother doesn't make idle threats. They lay in comfortable silence for several minutes, processing the magnitude of what they had just committed to. Marriage was complicated enough under normal circumstances, but marriage between a crime boss and a woman from completely outside his world carried additional challenges that would require constant navigation. Do you think this will work? Zara asked quietly. Two people from such different backgrounds, trying to build something permanent in a world that most people would find terrifying. Minjun turned to face her fully, his expression serious but confident. I think you're the strongest person I have ever met, he said. I think you see possibilities where others see only problems. I think you make me better at everything I do, and I hope I do the same for you. You do, Zara assured him. You challenge me. You protect me when I need it, and you trust me to be strong when strength is required. Then it will work, Minjun said with absolute certainty. Because we both choose it every day, because we both understand what we have found together, and because neither of us is willing to lose something this valuable to fear or outside pressure. As they settled into sleep on their first night as a married couple, Zara reflected on how completely her life had changed since that evening in the restaurant when she had chosen to help a stranger in need. She was now the wife of a man whose power and influence extended throughout the city, a partner in an organization that operated by rules she was still learning, and a future operator of a medical clinic that would serve communities traditionally ignored by mainstream healthcare. More importantly, she was loved absolutely by a man who saw her strength as clearly as her vulnerability, who trusted her judgment as much as her loyalty, who had proven he would risk everything to protect what they had built together. The dangerous world that had once threatened to destroy her had become the foundation for a life richer and more complex than anything she had ever imagined possible. The last thing she remembered before drifting off was Minjun's hand in hers, strong and steady and warm, anchoring her to a future that promised both challenges and rewards beyond anything either of them could have planned. 6 months later, Dr. Zara Kong stood in the main treatment room of the Williams Community Health Clinic, watching her medical staff provide care to patients who had never before had access to quality health care without fear of deportation or financial ruin. The facility that Minjun had promised was more beautiful than she had dared to imagine, equipped with state-of-the-art technology and staffed with bilingual professionals who understood that healing required trust as much as medical expertise. Through the window, she could see Minjun in the parking lot, talking quietly with Mr. Park, an elderly shop owner who had been struggling with protection payments from smaller gangs until the Biko syndicate stepped in. The conversation looked relaxed, almost friendly, nothing like the threatening encounters that most people associated with organized crime. That was the transformation that surprised everyone, including Zara herself. Under her influence, the Biko syndicate had evolved from a traditional criminal organization into something closer to a comprehensive community support system. They still handled security and mediated disputes, but they also funded scholarships, provided business loans to immigrant entrepreneurs, and ensured that elderly residents had someone checking on them regularly. Mrs. Chan appeared beside her, carrying medical charts and wearing the satisfied expression of someone whose day had been spent making a real difference. 17 patients today, she reported, including 3 who finally agreed to start treatment for chronic conditions they've been ignoring for years. Fear is expensive medicine, Zara replied, a phrase that had become something of a clinic motto. When people aren't afraid of being reported or charged fees they can't afford, they actually take care of their health. Through the window, she watched Minjun conclude his conversation with a handshake that looked more like a greeting between friends in a business transaction. Over the past months, she had seen him adapt to her approach to community engagement, learning to solve problems through relationship building rather than displays of power. He entered the clinic as the last patient was leaving, moving through the space with the quiet pride of someone whose investment had exceeded every expectation. The staff greeted him with genuine warmth, no longer intimidated by his reputation, but appreciative of his support for their work. "How was your day, Dr. Kong?" he asked with the formal politeness that had become their private joke. "Professionally satisfying, Mrs. Kong," Zara replied, stepping into his arms with the easy intimacy of a couple who no longer needed to maintain careful boundaries. Mrs. Kim finally agreed to let us treat her diabetes, and the Rodriguez family brought their youngest daughter in for vaccines they've been putting off for 2 years. "In your day," she continued, was spent convincing Mr. Park that it doesn't need to pay protection money to 3 different gangs when one very effective organization is perfectly capable of ensuring his security. Minjun's smile carried the satisfaction of someone who had solved a complex problem through negotiation rather than force. The other gangs have agreed to focus their attention on neighborhoods that actually want their services, he said. Mr. Park will pay reasonable fees for legitimate security consultation, and his shop will prosper without interference. It was exactly the kind of solution that had made their partnership so effective. Minjun's resources and authority, combined with Zara's understanding of community dynamics, created approaches that neither could have developed alone. The result was a Koreatown that was safer, more prosperous, and more connected than it had been in years. That evening, they sat in their private garden, sharing dinner and planning the expansion that would add dental services and mental health counseling to the clinic's offerings. Jae-sung, now 18 and attending university while still living in the compound, joined them with updates on the scholarship program that had become his special project. As the sun set over the city, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Zara found herself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment of perfect contentment. A desperate man seeking sanctuary, a split-second decision to offer help, and months of discovering that love could flourish even in the most unlikely circumstances. "Do you ever think about that night in the restaurant?" she asked Minjun as Jae-sung excused himself to study. "Every day," Minjun replied without hesitation. "I think about how close I came to bleeding to death in a private dining room, and how a woman I had never met chose to risk everything to save a stranger. I think about how terrified I was," Zara admitted, "and how that fear led me to the most extraordinary life I could have imagined." Minjun reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in the gesture that had become their anchor through every challenge and triumph. "Do you regret any of it?" he asked. "The danger, the complications, the complete upheaval of everything you thought you wanted." Zara looked around their garden, toward the compound that had become home, thinking about the clinic that served their community and the family they had built together. She thought about the woman she had been 6 months ago, working double shifts and struggling to imagine a future beyond student loans and entry-level nursing positions. "Not for a single moment," she said with absolute certainty. "This life we've built together, this work we do, the way you love me and trust me to be strong, it's everything I never knew I wanted." Minjun brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her wedding ring with the reverence of someone who still could not quite believe his good fortune. "Then we have succeeded beyond our wildest dreams, my brilliant, brave, beautiful wife." As they sat together in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the safety and prosperity they had created through their partnership, Zara realized that the most dangerous thing she had ever done was also the most rewarding. Saving a stranger's life had led her to save her own, transforming her from a woman surviving on the margins into someone who could heal both bodies and communities. The future stretched before them, filled with challenges and opportunities that would require all their combined strength and wisdom. But facing it together, as true partners in every sense, they were prepared for whatever came next.